D.C. from 2005 to 2007. Prior to this, Mr. Merriman worked at the Albert Einstein Institution and contributed to and edited the book Waging Nonviolent Struggle, 20th Century Practice and 21st Century Potential by Gene Sharp. More recently, he has published chapters about the dynamics of nonviolent action as a technique of political struggle and the role of nonviolent action in reducing terrorism. He also co-authored a guide to effective nonviolent struggle, a training curriculum for activists. Well, I will bring now to the stage Mr. Merriman. Thank you for coming. Party Merriman.
Thanks. Thank you. It's really great to see all of you here on a Friday afternoon when it's beautiful out. I kind of have to feel like I have to applaud all of you guys for being here. I want to thank Manny so much for organizing this and having me here. It's really great. As Paul stated, I work at the International Center on Nonviolent Conflict. The acronym is ICNC. And ICNC is a private operating foundation in Washington, D.C. And what we do is we look at non-military strategies to fight oppression. In particular, we look at what we call nonviolent conflict, sometimes also called civil resistance. I'll use both terms in my presentation pretty much synonymously. Nonviolent conflict, civil resistance, which is a way of struggling that many, many grassroots human rights movements around the world are using, have used historically, and certainly in this present time it seems to be increasing. We look at questions like, why do grassroots movements for human rights succeed sometimes, and why other times do they fail? What kind of strategies and tactical choices work best for these kinds of movements when they're taking on adversaries that may be armed, that may be very well financed, seemingly well organized, and seem to have all the advantages, and yet sometimes David beats Goliath. Sometimes these grassroots movements triumph. We look at how and why that happens. We try to distill best practices from looking at a wide range of cases, trying to find sort of key cross-cutting elements for why these movements can be successful and effective. And I've been doing this for about 9 years, and this present moment is a really exciting time for me, and I know for my colleagues who have been working at this for quite some time. Since the beginning of 2011, virtually every time I read the news, virtually every single day, I'm seeing a major story, like a fairly prominent major story about what a nonviolent movement is doing somewhere. I mean, that's remarkable. You think about it from Tunisia and Egypt, and now movements that we've seen all over the Middle East, as well as elsewhere. There's been some reports on China, there have been reports on a whole variety of places. It's amazing to see this kind of attention, this kind of, I would say, newfound confidence in nonviolent means, and the demand for knowledge about how these movements work has been increasing quite substantially in accordance with this increased usage. Though I would also say that nonviolent movements have been around for a long time, and really for the last 10 years there's been a great deal of activity, much of it not covered by the traditional media, but now that seems to be starting to change, at least in some cases. So what I want to talk about here is part of meeting the demand for knowledge about this involves really getting into some key elements for how and why these movements work. So, my presentation has 3 parts. First, I want to define what civil resistance, also known as nonviolent action, is. And although my presentation isn't overwhelmingly academic, I'm going to give you an academic definition of this term. I think it's important that we really precisely, clearly state what we're talking about when we talk about nonviolent movements and the kinds of tactics that they use. I'll also talk a little bit about in what circumstances nonviolent action is used, as well as when historically it's been used. The second part, the enduring truths part of my presentation, is going to focus on the dynamics of nonviolent conflict, the principles of waging nonviolent struggle that are as relevant today as they were 100 years ago, and will be relevant 100 years from now as much as they are today. The sort of timeless elements of what nonviolent movements encounter and the kinds of strategies and messages that have been tested many times and worked. And the third section is going to focus on new developments. Contemporary circumstances that may not have been present 20 years ago or 20 years from now as much, but are present now nonetheless and are affecting these movements a great deal. So one of which is the spread of knowledge about how people wage nonviolent struggle. And the second one is new technologies, which has clearly gotten a lot of attention in the media and a lot of interest among many different sectors. So we'll talk a bit about what new technologies mean, what they can do, as well as what they can't do. So, what is civil resistance? Has anyone here heard of Gene Sharp? It's been in the news a little bit lately. There's been some articles written about it. Yes, good. Those who know him are big fans sometimes. In 1973, a man by the name of Gene Sharp published a book called The Politics of Nonviolent Action. And I was talking with a friend just yesterday about what an interesting title, The Politics of Nonviolent Action. Nonviolent action is a form of politics. And in that book, which I would say is groundbreaking, and really 40 years ago set up the foundation for a whole way of understanding nonviolent social movements. In that book, Sharp, he used the term nonviolent action. I'll use civil resistance. Defined it as such. Nonviolent action, civil resistance, I'm paraphrasing, is a way for ordinary people to wage struggle, oftentimes for rights, freedom, and justice, without the use of violence. It consists of three kinds of actions. One, acts of commission. This is when people do things that they're not supposed to do, that they're not expected to do, or that they are forbidden by law from doing. So, for example, demonstrating is an act of commission. If you all went out and demonstrated, that would certainly be an act of commission. We could do it right now. Displaying of certain symbols, communicating certain messages through song, through the arts, establishing sometimes certain websites that document human rights abuses, rallies. There's a wide variety of acts of commission that can be done. And one of the things that I love about nonviolent movements is that they keep inventing new ways to disobey. It's really, really exciting. You can be very creative. I have 2 young children, and I would argue that it is in all of us, very deeply and very early on established that we know how to disobey creatively. We're actually, our creativity is unlocked when we're told to disobey and we're trying to resist something that we don't like. The second kind of action is an act of omission. It says when people don't do things that they're supposed to do, expected to do, or required by law to do. School boycott, boycott of certain products, British cloth, alcohol, whatever. I mean, those were 2 things that Gandhi advocated for boycotting. In Montgomery, Alabama, it was buses. They boycotted buses in the US Civil Rights Movement. Strikes, and there are a whole bunch of different kinds of strikes. Slowdowns, sick-ins, where everyone calls in sick. It's a whole range. Withdrawal of bank deposits, tax avoidance, tax resistance. There's lots of ways that you could do things that you're not supposed to do. And the third is a combination of both. And this, for example, would be the establishment of an alternative school, for example. Not only am I going to pull my children out and my neighbor's children are going to pull out of the existing school system, but we're going to create an alternative school for them to go to. It's a combination of an act of omission and commission. Now, notice in Sharp's definition, he's not talking about nonviolence as an ethical or moral proposition. This is one major break that Sharp made. He said, we can study this as a social science, looking at what's effective and what's not effective, regardless of people's moral beliefs. So he's looking at this as a way of struggle, not as a moral set of ideas or precepts. Okay. The other thing is it's not conflict resolution per se. It can go along with conflict resolution, but this is really about how people wage struggle. This is about fighting, for lack of a better word sometimes, rather than negotiating, though oftentimes the fight and the negotiation can go on simultaneously. So why do people engage in this? People engage